Most of us believe we understand the history of slavery in the Americas. We are taught about ships crossing the Atlantic, plantations stretching across the South, and a system that shaped the modern world. But what if that story is incomplete? What if an entire chapter 1, just as widespread, just as organized, and just as devastating, was quietly pushed into the shadows? Long before African slavery became dominant, Native American slavery was already deeply woven into the foundations of the Americas. From the very first moments of European contact, indigenous men, women, and children were captured, traded, transported, and forced into labor across vast regions. This was not a rare occurrence or a minor footnote. It was a system deliberate, profitable, and sustained over centuries. Yet today, it is barely mentioned in classrooms, documentaries, or public memory. Why do not we talk about it? Why are millions of indigenous lives missing from the story we think we know? The answer is uncomfortable. As colonial powers expanded, history was written by those who benefited most. Narratives were simplified. Records were erased. Entire communities were absorbed, renamed, or labeled in ways that made their suffering disappear from view. Over time, Native American slavery faded from public consciousness, not because it was insignificant, but because forgetting it made the larger story easier to tell. This video is not about rewriting history, it is about completing it. It is about uncovering the hidden systems that shaped nations, economies, and identities. And it is about giving voice to people whose stories were never meant to survive. If you believe history should be told fully and honestly, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps bring forgotten stories back into the light. Once you see this chapter of history clearly, you will never look at the past or the present the same way again. To understand how this hidden system of slavery took shape, we must go back to a time before European ships appeared on the horizon, when indigenous societies across the Americas followed their own laws of war, survival, and social balance. Captivity existed, but it did not define a person's entire life, nor did it condemn future generations. In many native communities, captives were taken during conflict and later adopted, integrated, or allowed to rebuild their lives within the tribe. Their status was not inherited by their children, and over time, identity could be restored. These systems were rooted in kinship, population recovery, diplomacy, and spiritual belief, not in endless exploitation. Everything changed the moment European powers arrived with a radically different understanding of human value. To colonizers driven by expansion and profit, people were resources, no different from land or minerals. Indigenous systems of captivity were not simply misunderstood, they were deliberately reshaped and weaponized. What had once been limited, situational, and socially defined was transformed into a permanent, commercial structure designed to extract labor on a massive scale. As European settlements expanded, so did their hunger for workers. Plantations, mines, and colonial cities required constant labor, and indigenous people, already living on the land, became immediate targets. European traders encouraged raids, rewarded captives with weapons and goods, and created markets where human beings could be exchanged like commodities. The logic was simple and devastating. Bodies became currency, and survival became negotiable. This transformation did not happen overnight, nor was it uniform. It unfolded through alliances, betrayals, and mounting pressure. Some native groups were forced into participation as a means of avoiding destruction themselves, while others resisted and paid the price. Over time, the old boundaries between captive and community dissolved, replaced by a system that stripped identity, severed families, and erased futures. Unlike earlier forms of captivity, this new slavery offered no path back, no chance of reintegration, and no protection for the next generation. In this emerging colonial order, cruelty was no longer incidental but structural. People were moved far from their homelands, separated from anyone who shared their language or traditions, and placed in environments where survival itself became uncertain. Labor was demanded without regard for life, and loss was treated as an acceptable cost. The goal was not coexistence or balance, but maximum output, enforced through fear and dependency. What makes this history especially difficult to confront is how closely it mirrors the later system of African chattel slavery. Though the mechanisms differed, the underlying logic was the same: dehumanization, permanence, and profit. Indigenous people were no longer seen as nations or communities, but as units of labor, replaceable and expendable. In many regions, this system laid the groundwork for the colonial economies that would later rely almost entirely on African slavery, making Native American enslavement not a side story, but a foundation. By the time African slavery came to dominate the narrative, this earlier system had already done its work. Populations were shattered, social structures weakened, and resistance made more difficult. The silence that followed was not accidental. It was the final step in a process that began with capture and ended with erasure. And it is within that silence that this story has remained, waiting to be told as part of the larger truth it helped create. As this new system of exploitation took hold, it did not belong to one empire alone. It spread wherever European flags were planted, carried by Spanish conquistadors, Portuguese settlers, French traders, and British colonists alike. Each empire spoke a different language and claimed different justifications, yet all arrived with the same assumption: indigenous lives could be taken, controlled, and consumed in the service of colonial ambition. The Spanish were among the first to formalize this system. In the Caribbean and across Central and South America, entire indigenous communities were absorbed into forced labor arrangements that were presented as protection or religious guidance. On paper, native people were described as subjects under care. In reality, they were compelled to work in mines, fields, and construction projects that sustained colonial expansion. Gold and silver flowed outward, while exhaustion, hunger, and unfamiliar illnesses spread inward. Villages that had existed for generations collapsed within decades, not from a single catastrophe, but from the steady pressure of labor demands that never paused long enough for recovery. Further south, Portuguese colonies followed a similar path. In Brazil, indigenous labor was essential to the early plantation economy. Raids reached deep into the interior, breaking communities apart and dragging survivors toward coastal settlements where they were put to work. When resistance grew or populations declined, the system did not slow down. It simply adapted, turning elsewhere for labor while leaving behind landscapes emptied of their original inhabitants. The loss was so profound that entire cultures faded before they could be recorded, remembered only in fragments. Northward, the French and British shaped indigenous enslavement through warfare and trade rather than centralized systems. Conflicts between native nations were exploited and intensified, transformed into supply lines for human labor. Captives were exchanged for weapons, tools, and protection, pulling indigenous societies into colonial economies that rewarded division and punished neutrality. Raids became more frequent, distances longer, and the consequences more severe. People were sent far from their homelands, scattered across colonies and islands where familiar languages and customs no longer existed to anchor them. For the British colonies in particular, this system became deeply embedded in everyday life. Indigenous captives were used in households, on farms, and in infrastructure projects that allowed settlements to grow. Others were transported beyond the mainland, disappearing into plantation systems where survival was uncertain and return impossible. What made this form of slavery especially devastating was its instability. Unlike later systems that depended on long-term labor, indigenous people were often treated as expendable, replaced as quickly as disease and exhaustion claimed them. Across all these empires, one pattern remained constant. The work never stopped, and neither did the losses. Exposure to new illnesses weakened bodies already strained by labor, while separation from family and land removed the social structures that once offered resilience. Death did not arrive only through hardship, but through neglect, indifference, and the assumption that more labor could always be found elsewhere. Over time, this widespread suffering became invisible. Records categorized indigenous people as workers, servants, or dependents, masking the reality of coercion. As African slavery expanded and became more visible in law and economy, the earlier enslavement of Native Americans receded from focus, not because it had been minor, but because its purpose had already been served. populations had been reduced, resistance weakened, and colonial control secured. This chapter of history connects directly to what came before and what followed. The transformation of indigenous captivity into forced labor created a template for exploitation, proving that entire societies could be reorganized around extraction and control. By the time the world's attention turned elsewhere, the damage was already done. What remained was silence, layered over generations, concealing the role European empires played in shaping a system that reshaped the Americas long before it was named, remembered, or fully confronted. As European control expanded, the system no longer relied solely on direct raids or forced labor imposed from the outside. Instead, it adapted in a more insidious way, embedding itself within the existing rivalries and tensions between indigenous nations. Long before colonization, intertribal conflicts had existed, shaped by territory, resources, and historical grievances. What Europeans did was not invent these divisions, but exploit them with precision and intent, turning conflict into a steady supply chain for human labor. Colonial traders quickly learned that the most efficient way to obtain captives was not always through their own military force, but by positioning themselves as indispensable allies. Weapons, metal tools, cloth, and protection were offered in exchange for prisoners taken from rival tribes. What began as selective alliances soon became dependency. Tribes that accepted European support found themselves pulled into colonial economies where survival increasingly depended on meeting external demands. Refusal carried consequences, while cooperation promised short-term security in a rapidly collapsing world. For some native nations, participation was never a true choice. Disease, displacement, and constant pressure had already weakened entire regions. In this environment, capturing and trading enemies became a way to delay destruction, to secure resources needed to defend families and territory. Yet this strategy came at a terrible cost. Each exchange deepened divisions, eroded trust, and reshaped traditional warfare into something far more destructive than before. Raids intensified. Distances widened, and the scale of capture grew beyond anything earlier systems had known. European colonists benefited enormously from this arrangement. They gained labor without exposing themselves to constant conflict, while indigenous societies bore the weight of violence and loss. Entire villages vanished, not only because they were targeted by colonizers, but because they were caught between rival tribes competing for survival in an economy that rewarded capture. Once stable regions became zones of constant fear, where alliances shifted quickly and neutrality was almost impossible to maintain. Not all tribes participated, and those that resisted often paid the highest price. Communities that refused to engage in the trade became targets themselves, isolated from access to weapons or protection. Many were pushed from their lands, scattered across unfamiliar territories, or absorbed into other groups as refugees. Over time, some nations were reduced to names in colonial records, their cultures erased before they could be preserved in writing or memory. Even among tribes that did participate, the cost was devastating. The internal strain of sustained warfare, moral conflict, and population loss weakened social structures from within. Leaders disagreed. Families fractured, and traditions built on balance and reciprocity struggled to survive in a system driven by constant demand. What appeared to offer security instead accelerated collapse, leaving participating tribes no safer than those they had been encouraged to raid. As this trade expanded, indigenous people became increasingly interchangeable in colonial eyes. Captives were no longer recognized as members of distinct nations but were categorized, transported, and distributed according to labor needs. The result was a widespread scattering of native populations across colonies and islands, severing ties to land, language, and ancestry. This fragmentation made collective resistance more difficult and historical continuity harder to trace. When the Indian slave trade eventually declined, its consequences did not fade with it. The destruction it caused had already reshaped the demographic and political landscape of the Americas. Entire regions stood emptied, while others were permanently altered by mistrust and loss. Later generations would struggle to understand what happened, not because the suffering was small, but because it was buried beneath simplified narratives that ignored how deeply colonial manipulation had penetrated indigenous life. So, this phase of the story reveals one of the most painful truths of all. The collapse of native societies was not only imposed from outside, but engineered through pressure that forced impossible decisions. Survival was turned into a weapon, and history remembers the outcome without fully acknowledging the conditions that produced it. As the centuries of exploitation unfolded, a shift quietly took place, one that would later be misunderstood as progress or moral awakening. In reality, the decline of Native American slavery had little to do with conscience and everything to do with calculation. Colonial systems were built on efficiency, and indigenous enslavement, despite its scale and brutality, proved increasingly unstable for those who relied on it. From the beginning, Native people resisted in ways colonizers could never fully control. They fled whenever opportunity appeared, guided by intimate knowledge of the land and supported by networks of kin and allied communities. Forests, rivers, and mountains became pathways of escape, turning captivity into a constant gamble rather than a guaranteed source of labor. Each escape represented more than a loss of workforce. It exposed the limits of colonial authority in territories that were never fully understood or mastered. At the same time, disease continued to exact a relentless toll. Indigenous populations, already weakened by forced labor and displacement, were especially vulnerable to illnesses introduced through constant contact with colonial settlements. Mortality rates were devastatingly high. In many regions, enslaved Native people survived only a few years after capture, making them difficult to replace as populations declined. What colonizers saw was not tragedy, but inefficiency. Labor systems that required constant replenishment threatened profits rather than sustaining them. Resistance also took organized forms. Raids against settlements, the freeing of captives, and coordinated uprisings made indigenous enslavement costly to maintain. Each conflict demanded military response, resources, and manpower. Over time, the effort required to suppress native resistance outweighed the benefits colonists hoped to gain. The system strained under its own instability, revealing that domination over people who belonged to the land carried risks that could not be easily neutralized. As indigenous populations were pushed farther from colonial centers through war and displacement, access to captives diminished. Colonists could no longer rely on nearby communities to supply labor. The frontier expanded faster than control could follow, and the logistical challenges of capturing and holding native people increased. Meanwhile, colonial trade networks were evolving, offering alternatives that promised greater predictability and scale. It was within this context that African slavery rose to prominence. Transatlantic trade routes provided a steady and controllable flow of laborers who were unfamiliar with the terrain and isolated from local support systems. Colonial powers viewed this as a solution to the problems indigenous enslavement presented. Africans were transported across oceans, severed from homelands and immediate means of escape, and subjected to laws that formalized their status in ways native slavery never fully achieved. This transition was framed as natural progression, but it was built upon lessons learned from earlier exploitation. The systems, infrastructure, and legal frameworks developed through Native American slavery became templates for what followed: plantation, economies, labor, discipline, and racial hierarchies did not appear fully formed. They were refined through decades of trial, resistance, and collapse involving indigenous lives. Importantly, the shift did not bring relief to native communities. While outright enslavement declined in many regions, new forms of control replaced it. Forced labor arrangements, land dispossession, and dependency ensured that exploitation continued under different names. The disappearance of native slavery from records created the illusion of an ending, even as its consequences remained deeply embedded in colonial society. By the time African slavery dominated the narrative, indigenous enslavement had already done its work. Populations were reduced, societies fragmented, and resistance weakened. The decline of Native American slavery was not a victory over injustice, but a recalibration of exploitation. It marked the moment when colonial systems chose what worked best for their ambitions, leaving behind silence where acknowledgement should have been, and erasing a foundational chapter that made everything else possible. Even when the era of open slave markets and mass captivity faded from view, indigenous enslavement did not truly end. It simply changed its shape. The chains became less visible, the language more acceptable, but the goal remained the same: control, extraction, and erasure. For native communities, the end of formal slavery did not bring freedom in any meaningful sense. Instead, it marked the beginning of a new phase of coercion, one designed to dismantle identity rather than openly exploit the body. Across the continent, indigenous people were pushed from their ancestral lands through treaties that were rarely honored and policies that prioritized expansion over justice. Land loss was not only economic theft, it was cultural destruction. Without access to traditional territories, hunting grounds, and sacred spaces, communities were stripped of the foundations that sustained their way of life. Dependency followed displacement, forcing many into poorly paid or unpaid labor simply to survive in a system that had been built to exclude them. For the next generation, the pressure intensified. Indigenous children were taken from their families and placed into government-run boarding schools where separation itself became a tool of control. Languages were forbidden, traditions discouraged. Traditions placism, and identity treated as something to be corrected. Education was framed as opportunity, but in practice it functioned as forced assimilation. Children labored in fields, kitchens, and workshops, learning obedience rather than empowerment, while ties to their families and cultures slowly weakened. These policies did not exist in isolation. They were the continuation of a long strategy that began with enslavement and adapted to new legal and social environments. When labor could no longer be openly coerced, identity itself became the target. Generations grew up disconnected from their heritage, struggling to reclaim histories that had been deliberately fragmented. The loss was not only personal but collective, affecting language survival, cultural transmission, and community cohesion. The consequences of this transformation are still visible today. Many indigenous communities face systemic challenges rooted in land dispossession, economic exclusion, and historical trauma. The absence of this history from mainstream education has only deepened the wound, leaving descendants to carry the burden of a past that was never fully acknowledged. Recognition, when it comes, often arrives without accountability, and healing is delayed by silence. Yet survival itself stands as an act of resistance. Despite centuries of exploitation and erasure, indigenous peoples continue to reclaim language, revive traditions, and assert their place in history. Their resilience challenges the idea that these systems succeeded completely. What was taken can never be fully restored, but what endures speaks to strength that outlived every attempt at removal. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this story. These histories matter because they shape how we understand the world we live in today. If this video helped you see the past more clearly, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. Your support allows more overlooked stories to be told, and ensures that voices once pushed into silence are finally heard.